On the Throttle is brought to you by sportbikewrench.com. Performance parts.
Welcome to another Performance Upgrades episode. I'm your host, Dave Moss. On our new bike, what we're going to do today is set sag, and that is primarily the first thing you should do. So today we're going to measure sag. Now, as always with every episode, there are lots of ways to do different things. And we would encourage you, the audience, to go ahead and email us with any tips or suggestions you've had in doing this yourself to onthethrottle.tv so we can post that after the webisode. Okay, now let's talk about the suspension components on the bike. In terms of the forks and the shock has one spring, the forks have one spring in each leg. Now most sport bikes have a spring where the rate is what we call linear. No matter how hard you compress it or how soft you make it, it will always have the same rate. So then when we set sag, what we are doing is shrinking or enlarging the spring based on the tension we put on it. What that will do is add resistance or allow for further travel based on an individual's weight. It won't change the rate of the spring, so bear that in mind. However, that would change if we had progressive springs and we're using those, but in this instance on this particular sport bike, we're not. So remember, the rate of the spring doesn't change. Also realize that on this particular bike, the rear spring is not matched to the front spring, so we have two basically different rates. So when we install the settings for sag on this bike, they're not going to match front and rear in what we need to do based on the way this is constructed and the springs that are put onto this bike. The first thing we're going to do with the motorcycle is check if there is what we call free sag in the back of the bike. So to do that, as we have the bike secure in the sport chuck, is to use the rear passenger foot peg and the rear fender and lift up. Now, as you can see, there's virtually no free sag here, so the bike is sitting what we would call topped out at its maximum length. Now in the manual it says it's 5.1 inches total travel for the rear shock. So we need to do some measuring. The easiest way to do measuring is use a decal or something like that, and we don't have that on this bike, so we used a piece of black tape which gives us a nice sharp edge corner here. So what we'll do is measure in as straight a line as possible using the casting on the swing arm up to the top here, which gives us 24.25 inches. We know the bike's topped out. So before you put somebody on the bike, the first thing you need to check is that we have the right amount of free play in the chain. If the chain is rigid and you sit someone on the bike, the shock isn't going to travel to its natural stopping point based on the person's weight. So in this particular model, you go right beneath the bolt that holds the guide for the chain, pull the chain up, and it should touch underneath on the bottom of the swing arm. So that's perfectly set up. We can go ahead, put Dave on the bike, and now measure the bike knowing there's free play in the chain and the shock will travel naturally to its resting point. So let's get on to measuring the bike with 3 different riders of different weights. So Dave, come on, jump on the bike for us. Now a couple things are important here before we measure. One is that you should be in full gear, whatever that means to you. A backpack, leather jacket, leather pants, boots. What you should be wearing is what you would normally wear when you ride the bike. That way when we measure the sag setup, we know what we're measuring is how you're going to ride the bike every time you get on it. So we had 24.25 inches, we're at 23.5 inches, and the general rule of thumb, just for a starting point, in the back of the bike is 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches. So we are really stiff on this bike, really stiff. So now we've got to go in, change the settings on the shock to allow the correct measurement. So Dave, off you get, we've got a lot of work to do. So now at 3/4 inch of sag, we've got to go into the shock and change the settings. Now we have a specialty tool here to be able to do that and allow us to do the job quickly and simply. Your toolkit may come with something looking like this, either in a 1 or 2-piece setup. Normally for a shock that has a ramp adjust, you'll get one of these in your toolkit. So check your toolkit, see if you have it. If you don't, then you'll need to invest in a tool like this, which is available at all motorcycle stores. That will allow you to change your preload settings for either you as an individual, as we're setting Sag up right now, or if you choose to go ride 2 up, then you'll need to change the setting again for the rider. So first thing is use the tool, spin off the upper lock ring so I can then move the lower ring, and then we'll guess at a setting, put Dave back on the bike, and then adjust it from there to get it dead on. Okay, now we made an adjustment on the spring. Obviously, to soften the spring, we turned the lock rings up to the top of the bike. So that should have given us a little more softness on the spring, so when Dave sits in it, it should sit a little lower. So Dave, just remember to duck so you don't get booted in the head. Let your rider get settled. Make sure the bike is properly settled, and using the same 2 points measure again. At this point now, we are at 23 1/4, so we're at 1 inch. So we have to take more off the spring. Now there comes a point where you have to assess what that spring rate is and whether it's appropriate for that individual, because if you make a spring too soft, it's just gonna bounce. So you want to make sure that the springs that are on the bike are close to your weight range. So Dave, off you get. Let's go ahead and fix it some more. So what we've done initially is loosen the top lock ring just enough so that the bottom lock ring can spin free. And what you'll see on the close-up is that both of the lock rings are now aligned. That way I can use the tool to spin them both at the same time, so that way I'm only adjusting once rather than spin the bottom ring up to the lock ring, then free that off again, and so on and so forth. So in this instance, I can very quickly make adjustments here to the shock based on where we need to go with Dave, and we don't have much left. So hopefully the other part of this is when we get done adjusting, the bike will show free sag. It's really important to have that on the bike in the shock settings, because the last thing you want is the shock just sprung super tight. So let's continue adjusting. Should do it. That should be enough. So let's get Dave back on the bike, remeasure where we're at now, and we should be in the ballpark range. Now Dave doesn't have all of his gear with him, so if we get this somewhere around 1 1/4 inches, 1 3/8 inches, we should be right in the ballpark. And the other thing to remember too, that the bike is stone cold, so the oil's really cold, but we'll get into the hydraulic section in a little while.